right? And I'll bang it up on YouTube, but that way for everyone else to go. So it's actually recording now, right? So that way I can throw it up there, but it's not a formal thing. So that way if you've got a question, they can just tolerate however long it takes. So what we were talking about in today's lesson was trying to integrate these ideas of genre and context. And so the cool thing about thinking in those terms, and let me do that a little bit more clearly, the cool thing about doing it in those terms is that you can answer just about any question you want, right, based on those two terms. If you've got a genre question, you get to be able to say, you can't look at genre out of its context. All genres emerge out of a specific context. The novel genre didn't appear before the 17th century because, one, you didn't have a literate population to read silently. Two, you didn't have the printing press was a new invention, and so the economics of producing a novel were limiting, right? So the novel doesn't appear, but in particular, the printing press created a literate population, right? And so a literate population could then read on their own, and it allowed for a genre designed for people to consume in the privacy of their own home, right? So in a pre-literate culture, theatre and poetry, genres that are there to be heard, rule the roost. But even when we look within genres, when we think about not just at the global level of novel, but if you think about specific kinds of novels, for instance, Ulysses could only happen during that period of the early 20th century. T.S. Eliot could only have arisen at that particular moment in that particular social context. Any other social context, it doesn't make sense, right? Not that you can't read it out of that context, but the context gave rise to that kind of writing, right? So if you take cinema and the kind of genre, if you look at on television at the moment, you could look at True Blood emerging out of a context, a generic context. So this horror genre emerging. Why are we all of a sudden seeing vampire genres from Twilight to True Blood? Zombie genres from Walking Dead, Shaun of the Dead, gone back 10 years ago, World War Z. These are coming up all around right about now. So then you could look at what's going on in the context that would create the fertile kind of soil for that sort of to grow out of. And I can't believe I just used that metaphor. But if we go back and look in terms of Othello, then we can look at the tragedy and the genre of tragedy. Well, what is it? What is specific about this genre of tragedy? It's about a downfall of a noble. It's artistically a higher form of writing for the period. And the point of it is to have a character who is socially and morally elevated to make the measure of their downfall all the more effective. So the effect of tragedy is on the magnitude of the downfall and the manner in which the tragic hero accepts their fate and deals with their fate, and how poetically they do that. Now, that is just purely looking at genre in a sense, and you're looking within a story, but then you can ask yourself, how does this emerge out of its context? Well, if we look at genre and then consider the social context of the period, and so it's the tragedy genre emerges out of a context that is extraordinarily tight in terms of social hierarchies. You have a clear nobility with no social mobility. You have a conception of the universe that has God at the top and then moving down through religious leaders and kings and whatnot. You have this concept of the divine right of kings existing at the time, that basically says that that kings are allowed to rule by virtue of being allowed to by God, and so therefore to usurp a king has, metaphysical implications, right? So you have a whole ideology and a whole conception of the universe built around these social hierarchies. And then so when you have these tragedies, what it does is it foregrounds the experience of nobility. It says, so you have a world that says nobles are more important than anyone else. And you have a genre that reinforces that becomes part of that conversation of saying that. And so then when you get into the 20th century and you have the tragedy being subverted, even the mid-19th century, with common people being the subject of tragedy, changing the form. So what that means is that the genre and context can't be divorced from each other. But then what you have in there, when you consider specifically Othello, you have a departure in some ways, or a niggling away at the edges. You don't have a pure noble in the sense of being a prince or something like that. You have a general, but also a general who's an outsider, a racial outsider. So in that you've got Shakespeare subverting or even challenging the norms of that social context just by the selection of his character. So, and they work in together, because that subversion only happens because the context says that is the area of importance. So you know what I mean by that? We spoke earlier in the year about Foucault and about power, right? And for every site of power, there's a site of resistance, right? So because the social context has the site of power being this area of the nobility, that becomes the area of resistance where you can, that becomes the battleground in a way for having a go at that power structure. So as you go into centuries ahead and you find that, well, nobility in that becomes less and less important, even to the point of being irrelevant, then the sites of power become about gender in the 20th century. So that becomes the site of resistance. So there's always, wherever power resides, wherever power, or whatever the discourse of power is, right there you find the discourse of resistance, right there. Does that make sense? Yeah? Not really? No? So at the moment, if you look in a school context, right, all boys school, shirts and ties. We maintain power over you by saying, Callum, do up your top button. There you go. You just did up your top button. You didn't even ask, right? Okay. But if you want to resist, you see students undoing the top button all the time. It's not just about comfort, but it's about flouting rules, right? Good, we say, so long as that's the trivial little thing like a top button, right? But that's the side of resistance, right? If you go to Dachau one day, or if you, I went to the Dachau concentration camp, and there's a statue of, I think he's a Jewish inmate, but an inmate who has his hat tipped to the side, his top button undone, and his hands in his pockets, right? Because any one of those things in Dachau would have got you shot by the guards. And so that statue becomes this site of resistance. Those are the things that they used to control the inmates. That's the site of resistance. So if we go back into literature, that we have this social context of nobility, then you have Shakespeare eroding at the edges. That becomes the stuff that people are interested in, right? That's what I think perhaps makes great literature. It doesn't just blindly conform with the norms of the period. If it blindly conformed with the norms of the period, it'd be boring. And that also ties into historical context. So when we look at the content of the play, it ties into the historical context. And so when I look at specifically at Othello as well, the selection of settings is tied to the historical context. We look into the historical context and go, well, why choose Venice? What was so special about Venice? So we learned from that podcast, that Shakespeare's Restless World one, that Venice was regarded as a sin city, this cosmopolitan anything goes city, right? So going back to that social context, that interaction of genre, history and social context, that Shakespeare is able to get away with eroding the social norms, the interracial marriage, the black general and all that, because he sets it in Venice, which is a place where anything can happen. It's also to have this particular play where you have a character who's duped into believing his wife cheated on him. Well, that was believable in the period because Venetian women were regarded as those kinds of women. And we see it inside the play with Iago in Act 3 talking to him about, you don't know these Venetian women, you know, they all cheat on their husbands. And Emilia even confirms that in Act 4 when she has that line about who wouldn't make the husband a cuckold if it meant making him a monarch. Yeah. So you have that's just talking about tragedy and a form of tragedy right there. But then when we look at iambic pentameter being part of that genre and context, that with iambic pentameter is something that students find foreign because why would you write? Why would you have a performance of real action in a language that's not everyday language, right? But that is still true. when you actually look at how actors speak, oftentimes the characters speak, it's all very performed. And if you want to get examples of that, watch real trashy action films. Anything with Vin Diesel or The Rock. People don't talk like those characters, you know. If you ever see a kid who tries to imitate an action hero, like an Arnold Schwarzenegger action hero, as if it's their personality, they look like idiots, right? So that's nothing new. It's just in this period, iambic pentameter was regarded as a high point of language at the period. But this is also a period where language is in flux. That we're tying back to the historical and social context. That language itself, the English language, was still being fought over. It was unstable. There was no dictionary. There was no consistent way of spelling, for instance. Shakespeare, we have 3 signatures of Shakespeare's. They're all spelled differently, and none of them the way we spell it. When we consider the literature of only 100 to 150 years earlier, the language had radically changed. So this is a period where people are excited about language and the possibilities of language and what it can do, and inventing new words, right? So this is an audience that wants to hear and actually hear language, and also it's pre-literate. So the sounds of language, when you talk about people who aren't reading the words, the sounds of the words are what's really important. And perhaps you could even go so far as to say that because the performance on the stage is limited in its realism, it's not like cinema now, where cinema can replicate and even exaggerate reality, right? That's not available. So the exaggeration of that sensory experience can't be as strongly visual. It has to be about what's heard. So the language is logically going to be really a lot more important. And so perhaps when theatre evolved further and was able to create special effects and all that sort of stuff, then the pressure on language to be so artistic changed, perhaps. And so when we look at, also if we look at staging, oops, let me get rid of that one and do that one again. Staging of the play is an important part of genre. How is it staged? How is it performed? Where do the actors stand? What are the exits and entrances and all that sort of stuff? Does that evolve out of the context? Yeah. Yeah.
Do soliloquies fall into staging?
No, we're not into staging, but it would be in language.
Okay.
I'll come back to that. So thanks for raising that one, though, because we'll talk about that as well,
Okay.
right? Probably both, right? And you don't have to worry about assessing which bucket it goes into. So because it is about staging, because it's about how it's performed and the manner of performance and speaking and that convention of the soliloquy, right? But since you mentioned that, is how can theatre show inner thoughts and feelings? You know, the soliloquy is invented to do that. And so that can look foreign to us because we're more attuned to the novel in particular, which inherently does it for you. You don't have to confront the reality stuff. And in cinema, which can do voiceovers and all that sort of stuff. And even modern theatre can show inner thoughts and feelings because now we have all sorts of sound engineering. And so then you've got the evolution of this element of drama, the soliloquy and the aside, emerging out of the context. And also, yeah, you're right, the limitations of staging of the period. Because you've got these other people on there and there's this conceit that everyone accepts that. I can see by the way he's performing that and the way everyone else is that they actually can't hear him and I can live with that. Or he's on the stage at the moment talking about his inner thoughts and feelings. Yeah? And so, but also actually just come back to staging. The limitations of staging influence the kinds of things that can happen on stage. Like I said before, that you can't kill someone mid-scene on the stage unless you've got a way to deal with the fact that his body is going to be on stage or have him carried off. So you have the limitations of genre and the limitations of that literary context or the theatrical context determining what actually goes into the text itself and when it goes into the text itself. And so when you have in tragedies everyone dying at the end of the play, well, that's not just about dramatic structure. There's also the reality that you're going to have all these dead people on the stage. It's going to look awesome, right? But then we don't have to resolve how they get off the stage because then Like at the end of Romeo and Juliet, you have the chorus coming out and giving a concluding remarks, at the end, the concluding epilogue, or if I'm getting the word wrong there, no doubt, but with all the dead actors on stage, and then they can all stand up and take a bow, right? So it resolves that tension, and it's the same in Othello, because how many people die on stage in Othello? It's just Desdemona.
Othello kills himself.
Oh, sorry, of course. So sorry? Iago, no, he doesn't die.
Yes.
No, and Cassio doesn't die, and that happens off stage, right? So in Shakespeare, a lot of the violence happens off stage because it has to, unless someone's going to die on stage and be carried off. Which would be interesting with Mercutio's death, how that would have been performed at the time. It'd be interesting to see how that happens. How do you resolve Mercutio being off stage? Maybe he gets carried off. And so then that means that the shaping and the way the play works and structured and all that kind of stuff evolves out of that context, right? And that also means that the Act 3, Scene 3 in Othello is all the more strange because of the dual time effect that you see in Act 3, Scene 3. It happens over weeks without any scene breaks or any reference at all in language to the change in... Sorry, I'm wrong there. There's the references to change in time happen in the language, right? But you've actually got to go hunting for it. Like when Desdemona is telling Othello to reconcile with Cassio. Oh, do it now. Do it on Tuesday. Don't let it go too long. Do it over several days, right? Then you have their handkerchief being dropped, going to Iago, and then it reappears in conversation late in the scene, as in ways that could have only happened over a period of days, right? And we can accept that. So then you've got in an essay you can talk about how Shakespeare plays with the limitations of what can happen on stage at the time. He actually subverts the conventions, the three unities we talked about. Yeah. And he just goes, I'm just going to have all this change in time. You'll get it, don't worry. Very unusual. I can't think of that happening anywhere else in his plays. Now, when we look at the circulation of ideas and the value systems of the time, where that comes into the genre and the ideas, particularly in the tragedy genre, is about these systems, in part one way to look at it, in the character constructions, the systems of reward and sanction. What behaviours get rewarded and what behaviours get punished? And when we look at the kinds of things that get punished, we find out what's valued. Usurpation, for instance, killing a king, it gets the worst kind of punishment, not because it's murder, but because of the value placed on kings. A king cannot be a good king if he didn't earn it by divine right, if he didn't earn it by birthright. And so we have, in particular, the usurping kings. Henry IV dies ill. It's almost like his soul rots away, and he's a usurper, but not an evil usurper, right? So he more or less earns the crown through battle. Richard III is poisoned in his soul, that he is bad, 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 right? And then you got Macbeth. So these usurpers are the ultimate evil. Engagement in witchcraft is something. Once you engage in witchcraft, you are going to be punished, right? You've got, and so when we look in Othello, what sorts of things are rewarded? Chastity is rewarded, right? And the thing about Desdemona is that her death, to have its impact, has to rely on her absolute virtue. And that's where Amelia comes in. So all the while Amelia's saying, it's okay to cheat on your husband. So you have Othello challenging the gender roles at the time. So it was Amelia saying, yeah, women cheat on their husbands because they do it. They merely replicate what men do. And Desdemona doesn't say, yeah, you're right. Desdemona says, no, that's wrong. Women should be pure and chaste. That's the kind of stuff she says. And also, the manner in which the deaths happen in terms of circulation of ideas and value systems, the religious order of the period. Hell is a very real thing in this context. Witchcraft is very real as well. People believed in literal witchcraft. And so what you're going to end up looking at here is the way I've mentioned a number of times, way prayer is used. That Othello demands that Desdemona pray before he kills her, so that because he doesn't want to send her to hell. Othello's, before his death, there's all this confession that goes on, right? That penitence that's there to make his death noble. He's become savage, but he becomes noble again. Come.
Is there anything significant when he says, "This is a subtle fool, who's a closet lock and the key of villainous secrets, and yet she'll kneel and pray. I have seen her do it." So.
Yeah, and I think that line there ties into all the stuff beforehand. That she'll be two-faced.
Yeah.
The seeming stuff, she's a villainous whore who's, she's cheated on me with my best friend, but yet she will pray, So even at that stage, he's still seeing her, I guess, as a hypocrite. But he's not consigning her to hell. He's he's kind of giving her some dignity, I guess. But then that's the significance when Iago says that he will speak no more, and they said, what not to pray? Because if he prays, then he can go to heaven, or he might not go to hell. He can receive some absolution or penitence, So that guarantees that he's going to hell. And the intertextual link that you have open to you there, and I put the link on the Twitter feed on the blog, is when Hamlet is standing over the king, right there to kill him because he murdered his father, and he won't do it because he doesn't want to send his soul to heaven. If I kill him now, he'll go to heaven. I've got to wait, right? And I've got to kill him so I can guarantee not only does he die, he goes to hell for the usurper that he is, right? And so then you have context, and that's recognisable to the audience of the period. That you can't kill an evil man and send him to heaven. You've got to send him to hell, right? That's straight out of the circulation of ideas that's happening at the time and the value systems. And so then we have value systems about gender roles and all that sort of stuff as well in the play. And that's where Emilia comes in. So like I said before, it's sites of power and sites of resistance. Emilia gives voice to the marginalised women. You have to go forward to Mary Wollstonecraft, and then later, she's what you might call a proto-feminist, right? The word proto meaning like the embryonic, a proto-feminist Emilia, giving voice. And so then your intertextual link there to Shylock, Shakespeare giving voice to marginalised people, even when they might even be a little bit questionable. But Emilia, her death there's a reward in there. Death isn't a reward, but she dies loyal. She has what audiences might regard as a noble death in the play, right? So loyalty is something, and service to nobles is something that's valued in this society, in this period, right? Cassio's loyal to the end. And what's his reward? He gets put in power, right? But also in the circulation of ideas is this equilibrium that exists between chaos and order, right? And that informs, going back to the structure as an element of genre, that the structure of these plays at the period would, and even maybe even in today's films perhaps, you have, it opens with a sense of order in the world, then you introduce chaos, and then order's restored. So we see the circulation of ideas and value systems is, what is the nature of the order, and what is the nature of the chaos that is so bad? And then you can see the underlying values of a period. And so you have genre and values and context integrated right there. They are inseparable. And so when you look at the Batman, the one with Heath Ledger in it, right? You have this order of a tightly controlled police state ruled by Batman, who isn't really answerable to anybody, right? But we trust that he's a good guy and he'll get things done. Chaos comes along in terms of this terrorist Joker, right? Who doesn't want to take over, doesn't want to rule the world. He just wants to burn everything, right? Very Al-Qaeda. It comes out of the context. That kind of villain emerges out of a time when there is this very real fear of a savage Al-Qaeda terrorist thing, right? That kind of text emerges straight out of that period, 2003 4, I think that film was, right? Maybe a bit later, but it's during that Patriot Act period. In Othello, you have this very real fear of a savage Turk, the Ottomans, and all that sort of stuff, right? They're referred to there, right, as the political fear. So they're the representative of all things savage. So therefore, you have that informing the actual content of the play, yeah, and the actual form and structure. So the nature of the order and the chaos in Othello. Order is the rule of law in Venice. Right? So that's coming out of this new humanist perspective of the world, that the rule of law isn't necessarily king-bound or church-bound. It's one where there is a system of laws to which everyone is subject, and man is at the centre of this, right? And at the other end of that are these Ottomans, represent everything savage. So there's a value system informed there. You got any questions at that point? No? Are we a bit more clear? What a silly question I asked, because a bit more clear. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stop there.